phenomenal. And it really is like a great segue because while we knew each other in a former life, growing up and kind of figuring out this world as Caribbean women and fitting into the larger society of the US, we also got to do that as professional women in higher ed. And me coming from academic medicine and Melissa coming from social work and trying to figure out like, what does that mean, not only from a professional level, but also women, minority women, women of color, and where does that kind of like, what's our identity in this whole world? And then throughout all of that is this kind of feeling of, you know, we have a level of privilege, and I'll talk about it from my perspective. Like I come to the table working in diversity and inclusion with this privilege of, I am not Black, right? And because I present Indian, there is this model minority myth that comes into play. But then within my own Indian community, I'm dark. And what does that mean, right? Because there's this, and I speak so plain and so blunt. So if for the audience that's out there, like when I say something, understand this is my own path that I'm talking about and my role. And you may describe it differently, but I think essentially we're probably talking about the same thing. But the idea of like Black or dark is like, stay out of the sun because you're going to get to like, the word is always Black, right? Why? I have no idea. It's always this like, you're going to get dark or this darky kind of thing. And while I have this privilege in my work life of presenting as that model minority, in some sectors, like that doesn't even matter, right? Because I'm still not white. So I'm not white enough in my Indianness, and I'm not white enough in my non-whiteness. Like it's this weird thing that we live in. And so Melissa and I were talking, like we always talk about this stuff because really looking at violence, I think colorism and prejudice and racial bias and that kind of is always a theme that comes up. But around the time of the George Floyd murder, we really started talking about what are our Caribbean people, what are our Indian people saying, and what are they perpetuating with these just very like so flippant, it just comes out, right? Like, oh, don't, why are you in the sun? Why, get under the shade, the shade's over here, come on over here. Or wow, your daughter is really dark with this like, you know, the face that does this thing, like, why are we doing this to ourselves? And so I'm from Trinidad, and it's sometimes I feel like the burden of it being compounded because my grandparents are on both sides are from India, but my parents were born in Trinidad. So I have this colonialism from India, but I'm not quite Indian enough. I have colonialism from the Caribbean, but I'm not Caribbean enough. But then I was born in the United States. Oh, dude, the intersectionality is real. It's crazy.
I mean, you know, Nirmala, I just have to say, I was so excited about this topic. And I was sharing with the rest of my sisters up here how, you know, in the Filipino community, this is really huge, this issue of whiteness and skin bleaching. There's whole like floors in the mall in the Philippines that are dedicated to whitening. They're whitening centers. So you could go out, put an IV in you, and, you know, and get whiter. I mean, whiter from the inside out. I mean, and it's, you know, this whole thing about don't play in the sun, don't lay out at the beach.
Yeah.
You know, my family wasn't so, they weren't so much about that, but they would talk about other people's families that were like, you know what I mean? Like my mom wouldn't say like, oh, watch out about the sun, but she would say like, oh, look at that across the street. They let her play in the sun all day. And so it was, you know, these messages around color that I never understood when I was a child, you know, until I grew up and could understand the history.
Yeah, it's, and it's crazy how we internalize it. So you know, like all of us, I'm on Zoom all day, right? And so Zoom has this like touch up my appearance. I don't know if you guys have tried it. So, okay, so let me give you a tutorial. So if you go to where your video is, where it says stop video and the little arrow up,
Okay.
so it'll say like, you choose your camera, choose the virtual background or video settings.
Okay.
If you go to video settings, inside that, it'll pop up and you'll have, an, depending on what like subscription you have, you can touch up your appearance. But let me tell you what it does for dark people. Not a damn thing, because I've played with it on and off, right? So it's not even colorism that we've internalized, but now as the human interaction, creating these technological plugins, if I want to call it that, right? That don't even recognize us either. Mm-hmm. Like I'm sitting there, I got to be putting on makeup, and I'm not a makeup girl, okay, right? I lived that. That was my 20s. I'm done with it. And I see my coworkers, and they're looking all like bright and like effervescent and like the morning sunshine. I'm like, why do I look pasty? Like I put on the touch-up thing. I don't see anything. I digress.
And I think that's the same with like Instagram filters,
Yes.
TikTok filters, Snapchat filters. And it's wild because our younger generations have access to that, or they're using, you know, Instagram a lot more often. And what message is that sending to them by having those certain filters that send those messages?
Yeah, I've heard like young people, I've heard them say like, just in passing, I could, you know, they're taking like selfies, and then I've heard them say to each other like, oh, use that filter, it'll make you lighter. And so, you know, this knowledge, like even in the clip that Melissa played, where you know, I wrote this down, like somebody told a lie one day and said that, you know, a black was bad, or you know, in terms of color.
And what baffles me, and I guess it doesn't baffle the researcher inside of me, it baffles the non-research side of me, is that we know the research, right? Well, like we're all in higher ed, we're all in research, and from 2-3 years old, children are showing preferences, right? And so my daughter, she's 4.5 now. And last year she was in the pre-K3 classroom, so cute, right? These little kids are so cute. And they're lining up to wash their hands to have snack after being on the playground. And a little girl said that I don't want to stand next to her, referring to my daughter, because her skin is dirty. Like she needs to like wash her skin more. Now, we want to make assumptions of who this little girl was, but the little girl was a little minority girl. So it wasn't even like this was where we are kind of maybe it's preconditioned, but in a right way sometimes, that bias or that prejudice is coming from somebody that's white. What colorism really gets to is the bias and the prejudice within our own colored communities. Like, let's use that antiquated language, right? Like within our own minority groups, where we are judging each other based on how light and how dark we are. Like at some point, and I've put this, like I'm a little bit provocative on Facebook, where I'll be like, you hate yourself that much that you have to like automatically go there about commenting on somebody's skin color when we are from the same cultural background.
It's interesting because you've been saying so many things that resonates with me, from makeup. You said, you know, you don't wear makeup, and all these touch-up features on TikTok and various social media. You know, for many years, the whole makeup industry just didn't know how to make makeup for people of a darker hue. Mm-hmm. And, you know, until magazines like Essence and different manufacturers came up, where, you know, you started to be able to find makeup that was really more closer to your complexion, to, you know, so you have that industry that just blossomed. And again, it's to make you look perfect. This notion of skin color and colorism always connected with what was beautiful, what was pure and perfect. And then you move it to children, and, you know, so many different studies and perspectives were coming to mind. I'm reminded of Kenneth Clark's work, educator and professor at City College of New York, he was the first Black president of the American Psychological Association. And he's known for, in 1940, did the experiment using dolls with children to find out about their attitudes towards race, and had a Black doll and a white doll, and would ask these very young children, like the age of your child, and ask them, which one do you like?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Which ones? And inevitably, you know, he was seeing Black and white children consistently selecting the white doll as the standard. But it was indeed his data that ended up serving as evidence for Brown versus the Board of Education, where it's like, we have been living in such separate lives, such lives of segregation and discrimination around color, that children could detect it early on. And you could see how this has impacted the psyche of grown women, teenagers. In the movie Dark Girl 1 and 2, the kind of trauma that young girls go through when they just don't perceive themselves as being beautiful, that they think they're ugly. And then it was Spike Lee, I mean, I think it was in the 80s, 1988, School Days, he brought that, it was like airing your dirty laundry. It was at first, oh, Spike, how could you go out and talk about the jigabees and the wannabes, you know, the jigaboos and the wannabes? And basically it was, you know, at a historically Black college, all Black people, how colorism was so much part of how they treated each other and what they thought was good. And, you know, you're in, you're out. You know, again, it goes back to what's beautiful, what's sexy, you know, you got it going on. And this runs so, so deep. So, you know, as I'm listening to you, all of, you know, from the research to the social media. Oh, my other thing, Band-Aids. Oh my God, Band-Aids.
Yeah.
Flesh stop color my ass, right?
Right. I just thought of a really older thing that would give away my age, so never mind. I was gonna say like stockings. You know, I you know, had jobs when I was in college that you still had to wear them if you were gonna wear a skirt, and I remember like they never matched. You know, even the I wanted to ask you a question, Nirmala, like in terms of what Renee was talking about. One of the things that resonates with me is we're seeing how all of this colorism is manifested in all these different ways that Renee talked about. You talked about the different modes of colonization, you know, that your intersectionality speaks to. And I think it's so sad that people don't realize kind of the origins of a lot of this colorism. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
So, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on colonialization and all of that, but for me, what came from that, and I spoke of two different ways, because in a lot of ways, I straddle, because of my upbringing, I straddle this Indian and West Indian realm. But what is constant between both of them is what Britain and what colonizers did really well, of who was in charge and what power they had. And a lot of times that power came from not only education background or wealth, or like social stature, but within the community and the culture itself, there is this stratification there. And so the white man, right? The white man was like, he is the right one, the more cultured one, the one that it speaks the proper language, right? The vocabulary and the diction, like you don't talk like you're from the bush. We like in the Caribbean, we talk about that a lot, right? Like, so when you're from the town, you speak the proper British English. And if you meet people from Trinidad who are from the town, you'll hear this almost, there's a Trinidadian accent there, but it's just a tad more refined.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you're from the bush, it's very colloquial, the accent is raw, and so this perception of educated versus not educated. And I don't even know. I don't even know what to say, the how or the why, but it's all of these things, from the language and the code switching, which we started right when we were first doing our introductions, and we were talking together, talking about just this code switching that happens. If you trace it back, it all goes back to this white is right kind of mentality that's held there. And unfortunately, it gets perpetuated because now we can trace it back to the origin, but we also have to, within our own cultural groups and community groups, have ownership over how we have perpetuated that as well, right? How it's become inculcated into just our socialization and what we talk about and how we say it, and how we, like when you're going to get married and like, oh, that girl's kind of dark, don't bring home a dark girl. Or like what I told you about the babies, like a baby, like we already have gender problems. You don't want to have a girl child. Like we have to talk about the other stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so you know, in the Philippines, who was colonized by the Spanish, and really by, we always say, the cross and the sword. So, you know, not just through warfare, but also through religious warfare. And, you know, quite bluntly, many of these friars and church persons raped Indigenous women, and the product of those rapes were kept inside the church as these, you know, kind of dirty secrets. And so what do you then do with these children? You educate them, you pass them off as this whole other class, and this mestizo class of the Philippines got, you know, of course, like lighter and lighter. And then, you know, really creates this, as you were, you know, saying around education, the difference between, you know, those Indigenous that literally work in the field and those that do not, where of course you're darker, you know, working out in the hot sun. And that has remained, like you said. How do we begin to own that? Like, how do we begin to change that now?
And then the generational trauma, you know, there's so much research, neuroscience research that has been out and is continuing to come out about how trauma still lives in our body and how it manifests itself generationally into just long-term health disparities, right? Like, just, this is kind of, if you want to talk about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences and how that affects somebody's long-term, like, am I going to be obese, or am I going to have high blood pressure, and all these correlative facts that we have. Well, let's take that a step further. And now you're talking about these people that the way they were born, the way they were conceived is through trauma. And then when we in our own communities perpetuate these statements of prejudice and bias, and we don't even give it a second thought, but we repeat it like it's nothing, I could cry right now just thinking about that, because there's so much, and I think Melissa will echo this, and everybody, actually all of you, all of my sisters on this call, that as an Indian Caribbean woman, if it was not for the Black Lives Matter movement, if it was not for the civil rights movement, I would not be a model minority. I would not be here. So the fact that I feel this, and a lot of my friends and family would be like, this is not your fight. You're not Black. Why do you care? No, this is my fight.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting. So much has come to light with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just want to read the book, from the book that everybody's reading, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racism. And he has a chapter on colorism. And I think it's quite striking when he phrases it from, colorism is a collection of racists policies that causes inequities between light people and dark people. And these inequities are substantiated by racist ideas about light and dark people, what's good, what's bad. Colorism, like all forms of racism, rationalizes inequities with racist ideas, claiming the inequities between dark people and light people are not due to racist policies, but are based in what is wrong or right with each group of people, you know, good, what's bad. And so it's interesting to see his framing, because the way in which dark people are treated versus light people, the preferences that people, even if they feel that happens, people inherently know that they're treated different. Even if they don't know if they've been privy to certain privileges, they feel that they're not treated the same, whether it's children, in terms of whether the teacher calls on you or not, you know, in terms of promotions. And, you know, you look at how people interact with each other, how they talk to each other. I mean, and again, I think it's so important to have this conversation in the context of history and colonization. And Damala, you know, I'm just wondering, in terms of your views of, you know, how do you see colorism situated in the conversation around racism?
That's a question, Renee. That's a question. From my vantage point, I see them as the same. I don't claim to say that the path that I walk is the same path and the same experiences as a Black American person or a Filipina or any other BIPOC individual. But because in my mind, that both those isms are rooted in hatred, in prejudice, in one winning over the other and one benefiting while the other one loses, and purely on the basis of what we see and nothing else, they're both racism. Whether we're doing it within our own cultural groups, we're doing it outside of our cultural groups, it's being done to us or not, there is still a winner and a loser. And I think that's what Kendi is getting at, right? It's this idea of, because of a systemic policy, that there is this have and have not, winner, loser, benefit, not benefit, but it is still all done by putting one class above another. And in the case of racism, that's very clear, right? Like, it's very clear what racism is, I feel. Well, maybe not to some people, but to me, it's very clear. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be overt. And the problem, I think, with colorism within cultural groups is that because we don't talk about it as much, it is not as overt. There's still this blanket up over it. And until us as people within these cultural groups really start to talk about it, like what you guys are doing on this platform, and calling it out, and us model minorities saying, that's crazy. Like, this is wrong, and it's wrong all the way, and we're being wrong to each other, not just other people being wrong to us, then how are we gonna solve the fight? And how are we gonna support our Black Lives Matter movement?
Exactly. And the conversation cannot stop here, even though we are bringing our show to a close. But you can see that we've just scratched the surface, that this is a topic that needs to be unpacked consistently. We need to help our children understand this, our young adolescents, and to give women an outlet, a space in which to talk about this and how it affects their lives. But to all my sisters of all youths, you are beautiful. Know that to be true. We want to turn this moment over to you, Nirmala. Nirmala. And give a shout out to someone or some group that you're thinking about right now.
My shout out today is to my daughter. She has given me so much purpose and so much fight inside of me to have these conversations and to be vulnerable and to stand for something, because right now the world kind of sucks, but her future is so bright and I fight for her.
Thank you.
Thank you. How beautiful. So we have once again had a wonderful opportunity to have a brilliant, bold, and beautiful sister to share her perspective on today's topic, colorism. We thank you so much. We hope you come back and just remain the authentic, beautiful self that you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. And I would love to come back.
Yes.